I raised the question of the country of South Korea. In 1960, it was worse off than Somalia. And Somalia hasn't really been on the top of anything for many, many years. Then the government of South Korea decided to become the largest or one of the best technological countries in the world. The company called 3 Stars, or not Sony, but Samsung, was established. It didn't earn $1 the first 16 years. Today it's one of the biggest companies producing electronics. In Africa, you couldn't have done that. You couldn't have been subsidized for 16 years, even if you had the best researchers in the world. And that was because South Korea was given a different frame to work within. And to exemplify that, when Kenya tried and said we need 600 more doctors 5 years ago to combat and to keep on the same level to combat AIDS, they had to ask Washington to invest for 600 doctors. They had the money, but IMF said no. You cannot, because it will jeopardize your currency rate and your exchange rates. So instead of getting 600 doctors, they lost 300 doctors to the UK that year. That was a lie, according to IMF. What I'm trying to say is, colonialism didn't just happen. Colonialism was there for a reason. Colonialism was never dismantled, and the relationship is there. I have slides to show what kind of money flows from the south to the north. Poverty in Africa isn't just something that happens. It's orchestrated, it's kept, it's organized. And this is, the last speaker said, we are doing wrong. We can do something about that. We have to get away from looking at those small things. Norway wasn't built by scouts or by churches. I mean, they had a good role to play, but wealth and welfare was built by joint efforts.
Okay, John, we're going to have to pass on the microphone.
Thank you very much. I would like to repeat again, there are progresses in Africa, there are changes in Africa. Previously, like if you visit an African country, let me use the country I know most, where I am from, Ethiopia. It used to be one-sided propaganda from governments. For example, when you read newspaper articles, today what you read is investment, it is business, it is a party, government criticizing itself. You know, there is a sign of change in terms of democracy, economic development, social changes. And more than that, like for example, again, an example, Ethiopia, you see visionary people today. You see an individual that has a vision, a family that has a vision, a group that has a vision. This was not the case when I was at high school, for example, some 15 years ago. This was not the case. Things are changing, but there are a lot of things to be done to bring more development, reduce poverty, especially people should participate. They should define their future. They should define their policies together with the government. It should not be synthesized in an office. It should not be formulated by a consultant or by an expert. Participation is key. Openness is very important in Africa. People should know. They should contribute. They should learn and also contribute. So that is missing, and I think that is also key for change to happen in that continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Ruth, and keep in mind that try to give feedback on something specific with some of the other presentations that you guys experienced.
If you want.
Well, I have 4 points. First, when it comes to Africa itself, I think that it's very important with Africa regarding itself as an actor and not a victim of past history or unfair situation from the historical point of view. So that's a little bit to the other speakers. Then I think that the way the international community is regarding Africa, that it should definitely be a much more recognition of Africa's role in developing, in defining its own policy and path. And all this talk that we are having in Norway about equity in relation to the new white paper, it shouldn't only be equity within countries, but also among countries, so that we should think about equity in a more global way. And then finally, accountability. I think for Africa, it's extremely important that African people themselves stand up for their rights and make their leaders accountable for what's happening in their countries.
I was a little bit provoked, Ed, and I think that was the purpose, so thank you. It's always good to see things from different sides. I'd like to bring the other side, and just one word that has not been mentioned here, and that is partnerships. I think development aid is really about giving, taking, sharing. We learn, Africa learns, and if we, when it comes to education, it has to be a collaboration between the government and between many different other actors, NGOs, churches, multilateral, UN, World Bank, and so on. I think that is the only way that we can get good results. But the person in the driving seat has to be the government, the people themselves. And if we remember that, then I don't think that aid is unimportant. I think in some cases, yes, African countries can manage on their own, but in a case like South Sudan, Somalia, there are countries that cannot take upon themselves at this point in time to foot the bill of education, health, and so on, and where we still need aid, we hope that it will be not necessary in 20, 40, 50 years from now.
The point about manufacturing, industrialization is central to build the forward and backward linkages to the resources which are now flowing out of Africa. Africa has traditionally supplied commodities for the rest of the world, but without benefiting from industrialization and manufacturing, with the exception of South Africa and Zimbabwe. That has to change if there is actually going to be broad-based socioeconomic development. The figures for growth are encouraging. However, that growth is coming with increased inequality. Gini coefficients of most African countries are going up. The most unequal country in Africa, ironically enough, after its Marxist-Leninist socialist revolution, is Zimbabwe. And so there are other kinds of consequences of growth which we need to pay attention to. Lastly, it seems to me that the history of Africa is always uncertain and can't be necessarily predicted. And so the United States has just formulated this whole new militarization of Africa under the new Africa Command. That Africa Command is supposed to do development in order to prevent terrorism. And it is pressuring any number of African states to take steps against, quote, terrorism. that is a whole new dynamic which is going to affect development trajectories in sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa.
Thank you. There were lots of issues raised here, and I'll try to just a couple. Very often in these kind of debates, there is a tendency to label Africa as a victim rather than as having agency. And therefore I liked what Bill Durbin said here about emphasizing that African governments actually have to take responsibility for the actions and they can actually do things. So, and so there's less emphasis on the external causes than what's usual. But then it's John Jones mentioned Africa as a victim of OECD policies and IMF and so on. But why should Africa care about OECD, DAC, and IMF? I mean, IMF writes reports about Norway all the time, but we don't really care what they say because we have had policies where we don't really have to, we're not dependent on their money in order to implement our policies, unlike Kenya perhaps. And why is Kenya in that situation? And I think it relates to many of the policies that have been run. So when you mentioned Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, I mean, one of the things he did was to tax cocoa farmers heavily. Cocoa was the main export of Ghana. Tax them to develop industry and to run industrial policy and do like South Korea has done. South Korea succeeded, but Ghana did not. So why didn't Ghana succeed in its investments in trying to develop industry and manufacturing on the basis of cocoa? So I want to tell a story of Tanzania. I was there in early 90s, and I read in the newspaper ads for tender for sale of cashew processing factories. These were factories that had been built with aid money, and they had never been operated. No processing of cashew had happened in many of these factories. The government had tried to industrialize, but in order to finance this, they had taxed the cashew growers so heavily that they cut down the cashew trees, because there was no money in it for growing cashews for them. So there was no cashew to process in the factories. And this is part of turning this kind of policy around is part of what structural adjustment policy was about. That was mentioned here, but that's a much bigger story than I can go into. So when we talk about industrialization, one thing you might want to notice is that, or one thing that's happened in Norway over the last few years, very nice, we can now in stores, I don't have to go to tropics or Africa anymore to get avocado and mango. That was one of the big attractions of going to Africa. Now there's plentiful of avocado and mango in the stores, but where did they come from? Have you seen African avocado and mangoes? No. They come from Latin America. So why can't Africa export these things to Norway? I think it has something to, it addresses some, or it relates to some long-term impacts of the kind of policies that have been run in Africa and discriminating against, for instance, agriculture in order to develop import substituting industry. Thank you.
I really liked, was it John Jones' approach with talking about Norway. When I came to Norway, to North Trøndelag, the main highway, E6, was a dirt road. And there were sheep walking around in the dirt road, which was the highway here. It was a quite primitive country. I think one of the reasons, I mean, I'm not an economist, I don't have a clue, but one of the reasons is taxes which are being paid, and relatively high taxes. So like Statoil is paying 78% as far as I know, drilling oil in the North Sea. Why do they negotiate down to 10% in Tanzania? And why did they threaten to go out of Venezuela when Chavez, that unfortunately died recently, said they had to had to pay 70%. Why do Norway not want to invest 1% of the pension fund in tropical Africa? They have been asked, as for, I think from the UN, to do that, and Norway has refused. They don't want to. So, my point is not to, I think too much of the focus is on what they do. I feel I'm a guest when I'm in Africa. I'm there, I'm respectful, I'm asking why things are like that. And I can say, you know, in Thailand or in Sri Lanka or in Brazil or whatever they are doing like this, maybe it could work here. And then people can make up their own opinion about it. It's not my business. But I think we ourselves from the West can do a lot about how we perceive Africa and how we deal with Africa. And in many countries there are huge resources such as oil in South Sudan and gold in Tanzania and Tanzanite and what have you, tourism. And I agree with Bill, that's enough. That's enough. I agree with Bill here. I liked his talk without PowerPoint. I loved it. I was almost doing the same myself, but I chickened out. To get industry, there's a confusion here. Many times you think about investment also as resource exploitation, such as gold mines, huge agriculture fields and so forth. That is not needed. We don't need Davo or whatever to go to buy half of the agricultural land of Madagascar to grow biofuel. But we need small, medium, or even large factories. Now, last Friday, I met an excellent guy. He was Swedish, born and raised in China, of all things, and he worked for 8 years in Madagascar, and now he started a factory in Tanzania. And he had 1,600 employees. He made a local school, so everybody could get a free education for their children while they were working in his factory. He paid double minimum salary, which is unusual. And everybody told me that they were happy with his industry there. What he was doing was importing cloth from China and making it into shirts and t-shirts and sports clothes and so forth, exporting it to the US for Adidas and Nike. After he started the factory in Tanzania, the export to the US increased with 38,000%, just from one factory with 1,600 people. And the number of jobs that are needed in African countries is huge. So having investment in industry, but not exploitation.
We sort of are still living in not an illusion, but very much we still believe that aid to Africa is very much the solution. OECD countries still pouring money. Some, of course, have withdrew a little bit. I mean, I missed the crisis that well, OECD countries are having, not global crisis as we usually hear. So, as much as we at the Norwegian African Business Association advocate for trade and see investment as crucial for African development, as I said in the presentation, we also do acknowledge the important role that aid has played on the African continent. It has lifted some people out of poverty, not many. Built good governance in some countries, and of course sustainable institutions as well as infrastructure. To improve the economic and social situation for the vast majority of Africans, it is important that NABA works close with regional, national and other Norwegian stakeholders in a broad approach, especially the civil societies, because after all are the engines of change. But one key thing that we do acknowledge, and not to offend all those who believe in aid, me included, is that aid, unfortunately, it has become an industry where the donor profits more than the person, the poor person, he or she tried to help. And of course, this has been confirmed by the last speaker with many examples. So we really believe that investments are the way to go. It has been the way of Asian tigers, including South Korea, China, as said, and definitely should be the way for Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. We've tried it for 50, 60 years, and this was something else.
John Jones, short reply.
Short reply to why do people willingly succumb to structural adjustment imposed by the IMF? It's debt, of course. They're indebted, you come to power, and you don't have money for the next day to pay the state, the government. You get your billions, well-calculated billions, and then you are in the pocket of the IMF. And you don't pass one budget unless it's been approved by the Washington. Year after year after year. This is the story of structural adjustment since 1980. Nobody succumbs to this willingly. And this is willingly knowledge. Thank you.